Entire civilizations vanished from the world in a single generation. The mysterious collapse of the Sea Peoples around 1177 BC shattered the Bronze Age and redrew the map of the ancient world. By the end of this video, you will understand the true story behind this forgotten cataclysm, a tale pieced together from shattered pottery, sunken ships, and cryptic temple inscriptions. Who were these enigmatic marauders, and what powerful forces could erase mighty empires from history? We will explore how climate change, failed economies, and epic sea battles converged into a perfect storm, toppling an entire age. This ancient crisis holds urgent lessons about the fragility of our own interconnected world. What do you believe is the greatest threat to a global civilization today? It was a world of wonders connected by shining sea lanes. Think of a vast economic web stretching from the sun-baked Nile Delta to the fortified citadels of Mycenaean Greece and far beyond. This was not a collection of isolated kingdoms, but a truly globalized system for its time. Palaces functioned as central hubs, controlling the production and distribution of precious goods. Copper from the island of Cyprus was alloyed with tin from distant, possibly even Afghan, sources to create the very bronze that defined the age. This metal flowed in all directions, forged into weapons, tools, and sacred objects. Royal courts exchanged lavish gifts, while merchants carried scented oils, exotic ivory, and vibrant textiles across the Mediterranean. A king in Egypt and a king in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, could communicate through letters carefully inscribed on clay tablets in a shared diplomatic language. They addressed each other as brother, bound by treaties and strategic marriages. This intricate network brought immense wealth and a remarkable cultural exchange. Yet this brilliant international order rested on a foundation that was surprisingly delicate. Its stability depended entirely on the smooth functioning of these long-distance exchanges. If just one critical node in this network were to fail, the entire system could begin to shudder. The prosperity of the age was real, but it was also precarious, built upon a peace that was about to be broken. They called themselves the unmakers of empires. Egyptian scribes carved their story into temple walls at Medinet Habu, not as a single nation, but as a terrifying alliance of many. The term Sea Peoples is our own modern invention for this coalition of seaborne groups who descended upon the civilized world. These carvings are our most vivid window into their world, and they reveal a crucial detail. These invaders were not a uniform army. Their headdresses vary dramatically from feathered crests to tight skullcaps. Their ships are unique, unlike the traditional galleys of the Egyptian navy. Their weaponry, from long straight swords to distinctive round shields, points to origins scattered across the ancient map. Their names, carefully recorded by the Egyptians, echo like a roll call of lost tribes. The Peliset, the Shekelesh, the Denyen. Each name represents a people, a culture, a homeland we are still struggling to locate on a map. Were they desperate refugees from a crumbling world, pushed from their homes by famine or upheaval? Or were they ambitious pirates, seeing a moment of weakness in the great empires and striking for their own gain? Perhaps they were something in between, a coordinated force of migration, moving their entire families by sea in search of a new beginning. To unmask these marauders, we must look past the Egyptian propaganda that paints them as mere agents of chaos. These temple reliefs were meant to celebrate the pharaoh's victory, to show him triumphing over a faceless enemy. But if you look closer, you see individuals. You see the intricate patterns on their garments, the careful construction of their vessels. These were people with skills, with traditions, with a society of their own. They were not just destroyers, they were also survivors, caught in the same catastrophic currents that were pulling the entire Bronze Age world apart. So who were they really behind the legend carved in stone? The story of the Sea Peoples did not begin at the gates of Egypt. Decades before their great invasions, whispers of their presence troubled the Mediterranean. In the diplomatic archives of the 14th century BC, the Amarna letters carried anxious messages between kings. They spoke of shadowy fleets, of Lucca pirates preying on coastal settlements and severing the vital sea lanes that connected empires. These were not yet the massive armies of later years, but scattered bands of raiders testing the waters. Their attacks were sporadic, like the first few drops of rain before a hurricane, probing the defenses of wealthy port cities and disrupting the flow of copper and tin. This persistent, low-level conflict was a grim prelude, a sign that the established order was already under a subtle, sustained pressure from the sea. The great powers, preoccupied with their own rivalries, may have dismissed these early raids as mere nuisances, but the threat was quietly coalescing, growing in strength and ambition with each successful strike. Then came a confrontation that could no longer be ignored. Around 1208 BC, during the reign of Pharaoh Merneptah, a formidable coalition of Libyan tribes and groups identified as Sea Peoples launched a direct assault on Egypt's western Nile delta. This was no mere pirate raid, it was a coordinated invasion by land and sea. The pharaoh's forces met them in a brutal conflict, and the Egyptian records proudly declare a decisive victory. Yet this first major defeat was a paradox. While it secured Egypt's borders for a generation, it also served as a stark warning. The Sea Peoples had evolved from scattered raiders into a force capable of forging alliances and challenging the greatest military power on Earth. They had been beaten back, but they had taken the measure of an empire. This was not an end, but an ominous pause, a signal that the world was changing in ways the old kingdoms could scarcely comprehend. The crisis reached its peak under the watch of Pharaoh Ramesses III. Around 1177 BC, the very survival of Egypt hung in the balance. At his mortuary temple of Medinet Habu, Ramesses had the entire conflict carved into stone, a permanent record of what he called a conspiracy in their islands. This was not a minor raid, but a planned invasion of terrifying scale. The inscriptions describe a coordinated assault, a two-pronged attack by land and by sea, aimed directly at the fertile heart of the Nile Delta. The pharaoh presents himself as the calm, divine strategist in the face of this chaos. He recounts how he fortified the river mouths with ranks of archers, creating a deadly gauntlet for any enemy ships that dared to approach. Meanwhile, his own navy was dispatched to meet the invaders head-on in the choppy waters at the edge of his domain. The subsequent naval battle was a brutal, close-quarters affair. The temple reliefs show Egyptian ships, their sails neatly furled for combat, ramming into the distinctively designed vessels of the Sea Peoples. Marines grapple on crowded decks, while the river and sea swarm with the fallen. Ramesses' account is one of total victory, a testament to his power and the favor of the gods. He depicts the enemy fleet trapped, capsized, and utterly destroyed. But the grandeur of this monument reveals a deeper, more unsettling truth. The very fact that Egypt, the wealthiest and most powerful empire of its day, was forced to fight such a desperate, all-or-nothing battle for its own existence speaks volumes. This was not a minor border dispute, it was a systemic collapse lapping at the shores of the last remaining great power. Ramesses III may have won the battle, saving his kingdom from immediate conquest, but the world he saved was already gone. The cost of this salvation bled Egypt dry, and the international order it had once anchored now lay in ruins. What could possibly have set these countless people in motion, pushing them to challenge the very pillars of the world? Far to the north, the story ended not with a victory but with silence. The Hittite Empire, Egypt's great rival and occasional ally, simply ceased to be. For centuries, its heart was the formidable capital of Hattusa, a city of massive stone walls and grand temples nestled in the highlands of Anatolia. Yet around the same time the Sea Peoples assaulted the Nile, this great imperial center was consumed by a catastrophic fire and then completely abandoned. Walking through its ruins, one would find a palace emptied of its treasures, temples stripped of their gods, and vast storehouses that once held grain for thousands left to the elements. Most haunting of all are the state archives, where thousands of baked clay tablets, covered in the precise marks of cuneiform script, tell a story that suddenly stops. The final letters from Hattusa speak of desperate pleas for grain shipments, a sign of crippling famine. They also mention ominous movements of enemy ships along the empire's vulnerable Mediterranean coast, a threat the powerful Hittite army, designed for land battles, was ill-equipped to counter. Was it a direct assault by the Sea Peoples that delivered the final blow, or was it a combination of internal rebellion, a collapsing trade network that cut off vital resources, and a changing climate that led to crop failure? The empire, already straining under its own weight, likely succumbed to a perfect storm of these pressures. The fall of the Hittites was more than the destruction of a single city. It was the unraveling of an entire world order. Their vast network of vassal states and trade partners from the Aegean to the Levant disintegrated almost overnight, leaving a power vacuum that would take centuries to fill. This was the ultimate demonstration of the era's fragility. If a land-based superpower like the Hittites, with its legendary chariots and fortified cities, could vanish so completely, then no civilization was safe. What other hidden forces were at work, quietly dismantling the foundations of this entire age? A similar silence fell over the Aegean world, where the great citadels of the Mycenaean Greeks crumbled into ash. At places like Pylos and Mycenae, the grand palaces that once controlled the production of perfumed oil and fine pottery were violently put to the torch. The intricate clay tablet records of their economies, written in a script we call Linear B, were baked in the fires that consumed their archives, a final, accidental preservation of a world that was ending. These were not mere attacks, they were the complete dismantling of a system. With the palaces gone, the centralized workshops that produced luxury goods vanished. The knowledge of writing, which was used almost exclusively for palace inventories and administration, was simply forgotten. The intricate trade routes that connected Greece to the wider Mediterranean went cold, severing the flow of ideas, materials, and wealth. This collapse was so absolute that it plunged the region into a period we now call the Greek Dark Ages, a time of profound cultural and economic simplification where communities became smaller, more isolated, and focused purely on survival. Across the sea, the vibrant port city of Ugarit in modern-day Syria met a similarly abrupt end. Just before its destruction, its rulers sent frantic, final letters to neighboring allies. One famous message pleads for assistance, reporting that the enemy's ships were already burning the cities and had done terrible things. The response, if one ever came, was too late. Ugarit, a critical commercial hub where merchants from Egypt, Anatolia, and Cyprus once mingled, was utterly destroyed and never reoccupied. Its fate is a stark testament to the domino effect that was now in motion. The fall of the Hittite Empire to the north had severed Ugarit's overland trade and military support, while the chaos at sea cut its maritime lifelines. It was a node in the global network that was violently disconnected, and its failure only accelerated the collapse of others. This was not a series of isolated disasters, but a cascade of systemic failures. The highly specialized, interdependent nature of these Bronze Age civilizations became their greatest vulnerability. When one central authority fell, the shockwave traveled through the entire system, leaving ruin in its wake. What immense external pressure could have simultaneously broken so many powerful and distant kingdoms? So who or what was truly responsible for pulling the plug on this interconnected world? The debate over the Sea Peoples has raged for over a century, and the evidence points in conflicting directions. One long-held view paints them as the primary aggressors, a barbarian horde that swept across the Mediterranean, deliberately toppling kingdoms in a wave of wanton destruction. In this narrative, they are the villains of the peace, the sole cause of the collapse. Yet this interpretation is increasingly seen as too simplistic, a story told by the victors, in this case the Egyptians, who had every reason to portray their enemies as pure agents of chaos. A more modern perspective suggests these seaborne groups were not the initial spark, but rather a symptom of a much larger crisis. Imagine entire populations, not just warriors, pushed from their homelands by forces beyond their control. They may have been desperate refugees fleeing failed harvests, displaced by rising sea levels or prolonged drought, their migration becoming an invasion simply because they had nowhere else to go. Their attacks were not a coordinated plan for conquest, but a fight for survival that inadvertently shattered the fragile states in their path. This reframes them from destroyers to victims of a wider catastrophe. Another compelling theory points to the inherent fragility of the Bronze Age system itself. This was a systems collapse. The very complexity that made the era so prosperous also made it dangerously brittle. Think of it like a towering house of cards. Each card represents a critical element: the palace economies, the international trade in tin and copper, the diplomatic ties between kings. If one card is removed, the structure might wobble but remain standing. But what happens when multiple cards are pulled at once? A severe, prolonged drought, perhaps triggered by a shift in global climate, could have caused widespread crop failure and famine, leading to internal rebellions as people turned on their ruling classes. A series of major earthquakes, evidence for which has been found at several key sites, could have physically destroyed the fortified palaces that were the nerve centers of power. With trade routes severed by piracy and the collapse of partner empires, the flow of vital goods ceased. The centralized bureaucracies, unable to feed their people or maintain their armies, simply imploded. The Sea Peoples, in this light, were not the cause of the collapse, but one of its final, dramatic effects: a wave of human flotsam cast adrift by a sinking world. The most likely answer is that no single factor was to blame. Instead, it was a perfect storm, a catastrophic convergence of environmental disaster, economic breakdown, and human movement. The old order, already strained, could not withstand the simultaneous pressure from all sides. This shifts the mystery from a simple question of who the Sea Peoples were to a far more profound one. What does this ancient collapse tell us about the vulnerabilities woven into the very fabric of a global civilization? The true enemy may not have been an army, but a changing sky. Deep within the gnarled rings of ancient trees and the frozen layers of distant ice cores, scientists have uncovered a silent, global crisis. The climate of the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC was turning against the great civilizations. A prolonged period of cooler temperatures and devastating drought gripped the Mediterranean world. For societies built entirely on the success of the harvest, this was a cataclysm in slow motion. Imagine entire seasons where the rain simply never came, where the once fertile fields baked hard under a relentless sun. The grand grain silos of the Hittite Empire, which we know from their final, desperate letters, began to empty. A single bad harvest could be weathered, but years of consecutive failure would have drained even the most extensive royal reserves. This was not a temporary hardship. It was a fundamental breakdown of the food supply that sustained cities, armies, and entire populations. The resulting scarcity would have ignited fierce competition for the remaining fertile land and fresh water. How long could a king command the loyalty of his people when their children were hungry? How could a complex, centralized economy function when its primary resource, agricultural surplus, vanished? This environmental stress created a powerful push, a force that could dislodge entire communities from their ancestral homes. It provides a compelling human motive for the mass migrations we associate with the Sea Peoples. These were likely not just warriors, but families, farmers, and herders, their own lands turning to dust behind them. They moved not for conquest, but for survival, becoming a wave of humanity searching for a place where the earth was still generous. Their movement, in turn, placed unbearable pressure on the already fragile states in their path, creating a domino effect of conflict and collapse. The story shifts from a simple invasion to a tragic chain reaction, where a changing climate set in motion a human tide that would drown an age. This globalized economy had a single, critical point of failure. The entire Bronze Age world depended on a steady, uninterrupted flow of two specific metals. Copper, mined primarily on the island of Cyprus, was combined with tin, a rarer metal that likely traveled all the way from distant Afghanistan. Only together could they create bronze, the very substance that gave the era its name and its power. This was not a luxury trade, it was the bedrock of civilization. From this alloy came the plows that tilled the fields, the tools that built the palaces, and most importantly, the weapons that equipped the armies protecting everything. The entire system was a delicate, intercontinental supply chain that moved by sea. When that chain was broken, the consequences were immediate and catastrophic. Imagine a master weaponsmith in a Mycenaean citadel. For his entire life, he received regular shipments of raw copper and tin. His work and the status of the local ruler depended on this flow. Then, one season, the ships simply do not arrive. The harbors are silent. Perhaps they were destroyed by pirates, or maybe the port city that acted as a middleman has been reduced to ashes. His stockpile of metal dwindles, then vanishes. His forge falls cold. He can no longer produce new swords for the king's soldiers or repair the broken tools of the farmers. This scenario was repeating itself in every major center across the Mediterranean. Without bronze, armies could not be re-equipped, leaving kingdoms vulnerable. The palace economies, which centrally controlled this production, found their primary purpose evaporating. Why would people remain loyal to a king who could no longer provide the essential materials for security and prosperity? The intricate web of international trade did not just fray, it was slashed apart. The vibrant exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies that had enriched these cultures for centuries ground to a halt. Regions that had been connected for generations were suddenly and violently isolated. Wealth plummeted, and societies were forced to turn inward, reverting to a simpler, more localized existence focused purely on survival. The collapse of this bronze network was not merely a symptom of the wider chaos. It was a primary driver, pulling the economic foundation out from under the palaces and leaving the entire structure to crumble. Out of the ashes of the old world, a new technology began to emerge from the forges. The great bronze supply chains had been severed, leaving kings and generals scrambling for a metal that was no longer arriving. But necessity, as it so often does, became the mother of invention. Across the Mediterranean, smiths turned their attention to a far more common material, iron. This was not a sudden revolution, but a gradual, gritty transition born from the collapse itself. With the distant sources of tin now inaccessible, the very recipe for bronze became impossible to produce on a grand scale. Iron ore, by contrast, was found in deposits almost everywhere, from the hills of Anatolia to the coasts of Greece. The knowledge to work it had existed for centuries, but it was a difficult, temperamental process, requiring extremely high temperatures and careful smithing to produce a metal that was stronger than bronze. The chaos of the era, by breaking the old monopolies, may have inadvertently accelerated its adoption. This was more than a simple upgrade. It was a potential democratization of power. In the Bronze Age, control over metal meant control over society, a power held tightly by the palace bureaucracies. Now, any local chieftain with access to a bog and a skilled blacksmith could equip a formidable fighting force. The balance of power was shifting from centralized empires to smaller, more agile groups, and the Sea Peoples appear to have been pioneers in this new age of warfare. The reliefs at Medinet Habu depict them wielding long, straight swords perfect for slashing, a design far more effective when forged from iron than cast from bronze. Their soldiers carry distinctive round shields and wear innovative, striped armor that suggests new methods of personal protection. They were not just raiders, they were early adopters, leveraging new technologies to challenge the old order. The rise of iron did not cause the collapse, but it fundamentally shaped the world that emerged from it, a world where the tools of power were no longer the exclusive property of a few distant kings. The echoes of this great collapse did not fade with the last embers of the burning palaces. Instead, they reverberated through the centuries, finding new life in the foundational stories of the cultures that rose from the ashes. The trauma of those chaotic years was so immense that it had to be processed, transformed from raw history into powerful myth. We can hear its distant whisper in some of the most enduring tales ever told. Consider the Philistines, one of the very groups named at Medinet Habu as part of the Sea Peoples coalition. After their defeat by Rameses III, many were settled in the coastal cities of Canaan. Generations later, their descendants were the established rivals of the early Israelites. In the biblical story, the Philistine champion Goliath emerges from his camp, a giant of a man clad in bronze armor, challenging the armies of Israel. This narrative of a formidable warrior from the Sea Peoples defeated by an underdog can be read as a later cultural memory of that initial, terrifying encounter with these powerful foreign seafarers. The legend gives a name and a face to the ancestral fear of the outsider who arrives from across the water. A similar transformation may have occurred in the Greek world. The epic cycle of the Trojan War, a story of a grand coalition sailing across the sea to besiege and destroy a mighty, fortified city, bears a striking thematic resemblance to the era of collapse. While the war for Troy was certainly a poetic invention, its core imagery of bronze-armored heroes, burning towers, and the utter end of a royal house likely drew upon collective memories of a time when such destructions were all too real. The fall of citadels like Pylos and Mycenaean became the stuff of saga, a way for later generations to explain the massive, crumbling ruins that still dotted their landscape. These myths were not deliberate history, but a profound form of storytelling. They were how societies made sense of a world that had been violently unmade and then slowly rebuilt. The line between the historical Sea Peoples and the legendary giants and besieging armies is beautifully, hauntingly blurred. It shows us that the end of an era is never truly an end, as long as its story is remembered and retold, shaping the identity of the world that comes next. Beneath the calm waters off the coast of Turkey lies a frozen moment of that lost world. The Uluburun shipwreck, a vessel that sank around 1300 BC, is a stunning archaeological snapshot of the Bronze Age's global reach. This was no ordinary trading ship. It was a floating treasury carrying 10 tons of raw copper ingots from Cyprus, carefully stacked in rows. Alongside this vital metal were jars of terebinth resin, vibrant blue glass from Mesopotamia, African ebony and ivory, and even amber from the distant Baltic. Every artifact pulled from the seabed tells a story of intricate, long-distance connections, a network that linked continents. This single vessel was a microcosm of the entire international system, a system that was operating at its peak just decades before it would begin to fracture. The ship's very existence proves the sophistication of that era, but its fate, lying broken on the seafloor, also foreshadows the immense vulnerability of a world that depended so completely on such perilous journeys. If ships like this one could no longer sail safely, the entire economic engine would seize. The silent testimony from the sea is matched by an equally stark record on land. Archaeologists digging at the sites of great capitals like Hattusa or the port of Ugarit find a distinct, dark line in the soil, a layer of ash and collapsed mud brick that marks the precise moment of their destruction. These are not the slow, gentle accumulations of abandonment. They are violent, sudden horizons. Within this burned debris, the evidence becomes chillingly clear. Scattered among the charcoal are bronze arrowheads, their tips sometimes bent from impact. Sling stones, simple yet deadly projectiles, lie concentrated in areas that were once defensive walls. At some sites, the remains of individuals are found in positions that suggest they fell in conflict, never granted a formal resting place. These are not the signs of an earthquake or a slow decline. They are the unmistakable fingerprints of organized human conflict. The ruins themselves seem to tell a story of societies that were not merely fading away, but were struck down with immense force. Yet this physical evidence also complicates the simple narrative of foreign invaders. In many of these cities, there is little to indicate a new culture moving in after the destruction. The conquerors, it seems, did not always stay to build their own palaces on the ashes. This suggests a pattern of destabilization so total that it left a power vacuum, a silence that lasted for generations. The shattered pottery and scarred fortifications are the closest we can come to hearing the final, chaotic echoes of an era's end. What does this tangible evidence from the earth and sea ultimately reveal about the true nature of this ancient collapse? The old map of empire had been wiped clean. In the silence that followed the Great Collapse, a new political landscape slowly took shape across the eastern Mediterranean. The age of the great, centralized Bronze Age kingdoms was over. Egypt, having survived the onslaught of the Sea Peoples, was a hollowed-out victor. The cost of its defense had drained the royal treasury and crippled its authority. The pharaohs who followed Ramesses III presided over a diminished realm, their power gradually eclipsed by the growing influence of temple priests and local governors. The imperial glory of the new kingdom faded into memory, never to be reclaimed. From this political vacuum, new and dynamic societies began to emerge. Along the coast of modern-day Lebanon, the Phoenician city-states of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos rose to prominence. Unburdened by the old palace systems, they became the new masters of the sea. They rebuilt the shattered trade networks, but in a completely different way. Their power was not based on territorial conquest or vast armies, but on commerce and navigation. They established trading posts and colonies across the Mediterranean, from Cyprus to North Africa and even as far as Spain, weaving a new web of economic connection. They were not emperors, they were entrepreneurs, and their most lasting legacy would be an alphabet that simplified writing, a tool for business that would one day form the basis of our own. Inland, the Arameans, a people likely pushed into the region by the same upheavals that created the Sea Peoples, carved out powerful kingdoms in the Syrian interior. Their strength lay in controlling the overland trade routes, and their language, Aramaic, became the new lingua franca of the Near East, the common tongue of merchants and diplomats for centuries to come. It was a language of connection rising from the ashes of Babel. Meanwhile, in Greece, the profound isolation of the Dark Ages forced a fundamental social reorganization. The great palace bureaucracies were gone, and with them the concept of a wanax, a supreme king. People gathered in smaller, more defensible communities. Out of this necessity, a revolutionary new idea was born, the polis, or independent city-state. This was not ruled by a distant, godlike monarch, but by a community of citizens, however narrowly defined at first. It was from this crucible of collapse that the seeds of democracy, philosophy, and classical Greek culture would eventually sprout. The collapse was not merely an end, it was a brutal, necessary clearing. It toppled rigid, top-heavy systems and made space for experimentation. The old world, with its international brotherhood of kings, had reached its limits. The new world, though born from chaos, was more resilient, more diverse, and in many ways more recognizably our own. How does a civilization's greatest crisis ultimately become the source of its renewal? One of the most enduring legacies of this entire era is written not just in ruins but in transformation. The Peliset, a name forever carved into the walls of Medinet Habu, did not vanish after their battles with Egypt. Instead, they settled. Archaeological discoveries at cities like Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Ekron reveal a clear and sudden cultural shift in the 12th century BC. The pottery changes dramatically, from local Canaanite styles to beautifully decorated Mycenaean-inspired ware with intricate spirals and stylized birds. They brought new culinary tastes, using distinctive bell-shaped cooking pots ideal for slow-simmering stews, and they constructed buildings with hearths in a central, hall-like layout, an architectural footprint completely foreign to the region. These were not temporary raiders, they were people putting down roots, bringing their homeland with them in the shapes of their pots and the plans of their homes. But survival demanded adaptation. Over the generations, a fascinating cultural fusion took place. The Philistines, as they became known, began to adopt the local Semitic language and incorporate Canaanite deities into their own pantheon. They became part of the landscape, yet they maintained a distinct identity that set them apart from their neighbors. This very distinction would eventually place them on a collision course with the emerging kingdoms of Israel and Judah, their rivalry immortalized in biblical narratives. Their journey from feared Seabora invaders to established settlers of the coastal plain is a profound reminder. It shows that even the most destructive forces of collapse can give way to new beginnings, and that the line between invader and neighbor is often erased by the simple, relentless passage of time. Yet pinning this entire transformation to a single year like 1177 BC can be misleading. While that date marks a dramatic confrontation, the unraveling was far from instantaneous. Think of it less like a light switch flipping off and more like a slow burning fuse. Archaeological layers at sites across the eastern Mediterranean reveal a complex rhythm of crisis and attempted recovery, a story told in cycles of destruction and rebuilding. A city like Hattusa was not just sacked once, it shows signs of being partially abandoned, then reoccupied by a smaller population before its final, complete desertion. Other coastal settlements were destroyed, only to be rebuilt on a smaller scale decades later, and then perhaps faced another wave of violence a generation after that. This staggered timeline challenges the powerful image of a single apocalyptic event. Instead, it paints a picture of a global system under prolonged and intensifying stress. Different regions faltered at different times, like sections of a vast network flickering and going dark one by one. This nuanced view helps explain the patchwork of outcomes. Some areas blessed with more resilient local economies or geographic advantages managed a relatively quick recovery. Others, whose entire existence was tied to the centralized palace system, were simply erased from the map for centuries. The debate over the timeline is not just academic, it fundamentally changes how we understand the nature of collapse itself. Was it a sudden storm or a changing climate that slowly starved the old world until it could no longer sustain itself? The ruins of the Bronze Age hold a stark warning for any civilization that believes itself eternal. This was not a simple story of invaders and defenders, but a profound lesson in systemic fragility. The highly interconnected world of the late Bronze Age, for all its brilliance, possessed a critical weakness. Its specialized parts, from the copper miners of Cyprus to the grain scribes of Hattusa, were so deeply interdependent that the failure of a single node could trigger a cascade, pulling down the entire network. Their prosperity created a kind of rigidity, an inability to adapt swiftly when the foundations began to shake. When climate shifts strained harvests and severed trade routes, the complex political and economic machinery had no backup plan. It was a house of cards, stunningly beautiful but vulnerable to a single gust of wind. This ancient case study forces a difficult question upon us. In our own hyper-connected global civilization, have we built a system that is more resilient or one that is even more brittle? Our just-in-time supply chains, our digital networks, and our international financial systems are miracles of efficiency, yet they also create pathways for shock to travel at the speed of light. A pandemic, a volcanic eruption that darkens the skies, or a conflict in a key resource region could test our modern world in ways that echo the challenges of 3,000 years ago. The core vulnerabilities remain hauntingly familiar: climate stress, resource competition, and the unpredictable movement of people. The story of the Sea Peoples is a cautionary tale about the price of complexity without resilience. It teaches us that a civilization's greatest strength, its interconnectedness, can also be its greatest Achilles heel when that web is torn. Yet from the rubble of that collapsed age, a powerful message of hope also emerges. The end of the Bronze Age was not a full stop, but a brutal, necessary semicolon. The old kingdoms, with their top-heavy bureaucracies and rigid hierarchies, were cleared away. In their place, something new and more adaptable began to grow. The Phoenicians, rising from the ashes of coastal cities, pioneered a decentralized model of commerce that circled the Mediterranean. The Greeks, isolated and forced to rely on themselves, invented the concept of the citizen-led city-state. The Arameans forged new overland connections, and their language became a fresh bridge between cultures. This reinvention demonstrates a fundamental truth about human societies. Collapse, while traumatic, can create the space for innovation. It breaks monopolies on power and knowledge, forcing communities to find new ways to organize, to trade, and to govern. The crisis becomes a crucible, burning away what is no longer functional and making room for what might be. Our own world faces immense and interconnected challenges, but the lesson from the ashes is not one of despair. It is a call to build flexibility into the very heart of our systems, to value redundancy over pure efficiency, and to remember that the end of one chapter is always the beginning of the next. The true legacy of the Sea Peoples may be this dual insight: a sobering reflection on our own fragility, and an enduring testament to our capacity for renewal. These ancient echoes resonate with an unnerving clarity in our own time. We now inhabit a world woven together by digital threads and global supply chains, a system of staggering complexity that also shares the Bronze Age's core vulnerability. Climate stress, once a slow-moving pressure on harvests, now manifests in intensifying weather patterns and rising sea levels, creating new patterns of human movement and displacement. Our just-in-time economies, masterpieces of efficiency that deliver goods across continents, can falter when a single port is blocked or a crucial resource becomes scarce. The geopolitical chessboard, with its shifting alliances and tensions, mirrors the fragile diplomatic balance that once existed between Hattusa, Egypt, and Mycenae. The core principle is identical. Interconnection creates immense strength, but it also builds in pathways for shock. A failure in one specialized node can ripple outward with astonishing speed, testing the resilience of the entire structure. What would happen if a key digital network failed or a vital shipping lane was closed for months? The mechanisms are modern, but the underlying dynamic is ancient history. This is not a prediction of doom, but a powerful argument for proactive foresight. The lesson of the collapse is not that interconnection is bad, but that it requires deliberate reinforcement. We are challenged to build buffers into our systems, to value redundancy over pure lean efficiency, and to diversify our critical resources. The ghosts of the sea peoples do not whisper of an inevitable fate. They speak instead of the critical importance of heeding early warnings. They remind us that the greatest threat to any civilization is not the specific crisis that strikes, but the failure to recognize its own fragilities before the pressure becomes too great. Their story, etched in temple stone and layered in ash, is a permanent invitation to learn. Even after centuries of study, the sea people stubbornly refuse to surrender all their secrets. The most fundamental questions of where they came from and what drove them remain locked in academic debate, a puzzle with too many missing pieces. We know the names the Egyptians gave them, the Peliset, the Denyen, the Shekelesh, but matching these names to specific homelands has proven incredibly difficult. Were the Peliset from the Aegean world? Were the Denyen connected to the Danaoi of Greek legend? Each theory is a compelling argument built on scattered pottery styles, weapon types, and linguistic hints, but a definitive map of their origins is still beyond our grasp. This uncertainty extends to their very nature as a coalition. Was this a true, organized alliance with a shared goal, or a more temporary convergence of different groups, all fleeing the same pressures and finding strength in numbers? Their motivations are equally opaque. The Egyptian records depict pure, wanton aggression, but modern perspectives see a far more complex picture. Were these campaigns of conquest, or were they mass migrations of desperate people? Their attacks a tragic byproduct of their fight for survival. The violence was real, but the intent behind it is a shadow we are still trying to illuminate. Perhaps the most haunting mystery is what became of them after the dust settled. Beyond the Philistines who settled in Canaan, the other groups seem to vanish from the historical record. Did they assimilate quietly into the populations of the lands they raided? Were they absorbed by other rising cultures, their distinct identities fading over generations? Or did some simply sail beyond the horizon, their story lost to the deep? The fragmentary nature of the evidence is the core reason this mystery endures. A single clay tablet or a newly discovered shipwreck could overturn decades of accepted theory. Today, science offers new ways to interrogate the past. DNA analysis of remains from potential sea peoples' burial sites could finally trace their genetic lineage, revealing their geographic origins and their relationship to the populations they encountered. Underwater archaeology continues to search for more shipwrecks like the one at Uluburun, time capsules that could hold the everyday possessions of these enigmatic mariners, telling us not just how they fought, but how they lived. Each scrape of the archaeologist's trowel, each sediment core pulled from the seabed, carries the potential to rewrite a crucial chapter of human history. The enduring allure of the Sea Peoples lies in this very incompleteness. They are a ghost in the machine of history, a reminder that even the most world-shattering events can leave behind a whisper, an invitation for us to keep listening, to keep searching for the truth in the silence. Their shadowy legacy extends far beyond the dusty pages of history books. The Sea Peoples have become a powerful symbol in modern art, literature, and film, their story endlessly reshaped to reflect our own deepest anxieties. In blockbuster movies and epic video games, they are frequently cast as the ultimate barbarian horde, a faceless wave of destruction descending upon a civilized world. Their aesthetic is often one of chaos, with rugged, otherworldly armor and a savage ferocity that makes them the perfect antagonists for narratives about the fall of empires. These dramatized portrayals tap into a fundamental human fascination with apocalyptic tales, stories where the established order is tested and shattered. The Sea Peoples serve as a blank slate onto which we project our fears of societal collapse, of the unknown forces that could one day unravel our own complex world. They represent the ultimate what-if, the chilling possibility of a coordinated disaster that pushes humanity to the brink. While these cultural depictions are rarely historically accurate, often amplifying the Egyptian view of them as mere agents of chaos, they perform a vital function. They take an obscure, academically dense historical episode and transform it into a compelling human drama. A player controlling a character defending a virtual city from a Sea People's invasion, or a reader following a fictional survivor of their attacks, engages with this ancient mystery on an emotional level that a textbook could never provide. This creative reinterpretation, for all its artistic license, keeps the memory of this great collapse alive. It ensures that the question of who these mysterious mariners were continues to spark curiosity in new generations, inviting them to look past the myth and discover the even more fascinating truth hidden beneath. Those Egyptian temple inscriptions were the very first puzzle pieces to be found. When 19th century scholars first deciphered the hieroglyphs at Medinet Habu, they were reading the words of Pharaoh Rameses III himself. His account was powerful, dramatic, and utterly convincing. He spoke of a conspiracy of foreign lands that plotted on their islands, of a desperate battle for survival that he alone had won. For a long time, historians took this narrative at face value. The story they constructed was a straightforward one, a tale of barbarian invaders sweeping across the Mediterranean, toppling empires, and plunging the world into a dark age. The Sea Peoples were the clear and singular villains of this ancient drama. This initial interpretation, born from the victor's own press release, cast a very long shadow. It shaped textbooks and popular understanding for generations, framing the collapse as a simple story of us versus them. But what happens when the only written testimony comes from one side of the conflict? A more complete picture began to emerge as the spade of the archaeologist started to unearth evidence far beyond Egypt's borders. Scholars began comparing the pharaoh's boasts with the silent testimony of burned cities and abandoned ports from Greece to Anatolia. They realized that the Egyptian records, while invaluable, told only part of the story. They were a snapshot from the perspective of the one civilization that managed to hold the line, a perspective that naturally emphasized external threats over internal weaknesses. Modern Egyptology has evolved into a profoundly interdisciplinary endeavor. It no longer just translates texts, it cross-references them with tree ring data that reveals ancient droughts, with sediment cores that show shifts in climate, and with pottery fragments that trace the movement of peoples. This collaborative approach revealed a much more complex and interesting truth. The Sea Peoples were not a supernatural force of destruction that appeared out of nowhere. They were a symptom of a system already in deep distress. the old narrative of a dark age brought by invaders has given way to a model of a system's collapse where environmental, economic, and social pressures converge to break the Bronze Age world. The story of the Sea Peoples, therefore, is also the story of how we write history itself. It is a powerful lesson in the importance of questioning a single source, no matter how authoritative it seems. Our understanding of the past is not a static monument, but a living conversation, constantly being refined with every new discovery. From the silence of abandoned palaces, a new political geography began to take shape. The great power vacuum left by the Hittites and the diminished Egyptians did not lead to an age of pure darkness. Instead, it created an opening for smaller, more agile states to rise, built not on imperial conquest but on practical ingenuity. Along the coast of what is now Lebanon, the cities of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, which had survived the worst of the collapse, found their moment. Unburdened by the heavy bureaucracy of the old palace systems, the people we know as the Phoenicians turned to their greatest asset, the sea. They became the master weavers of a new commercial web, one that was decentralized and resilient. Their ships, crafted from the famed cedars of their homeland, did not carry the demands of a distant emperor but the goods of countless merchants. They established trading posts from Cyprus to Sardinia, and eventually to the far end of the Mediterranean, founding Carthage, a city that would one day challenge Rome itself. Their greatest innovation was perhaps their script, a simple alphabet of just 22 characters. This was not a tool for royal scribes to record tribute, but a practical instrument for merchants to track contracts and cargo. It was a technology of connection designed for speed and clarity, and it would form the bedrock of writing systems across the ancient world, including our own. Inland, a different kind of power was coalescing. The Arameans, likely pastoralists pushed into the region by the same upheavals, carved out powerful kingdoms in the Syrian interior, with Damascus as their most famous center. Their strength lay in controlling the overland trade routes that were slowly reknitting the fractured landscape, and with their caravans and armies came their language, Aramaic. It gradually spread, becoming the common tongue of merchants, diplomats, and eventually empires from Assyria to Persia. It was a new lingua franca rising from the ashes of the old, a linguistic bridge that connected diverse peoples for nearly 1,000 years. This reorganization was not a step backward into chaos, but a fundamental restructuring. The massive, top-heavy empires of the Bronze Age were replaced by a patchwork of smaller, more flexible states. These new entities were nimbler, better able to adapt to local conditions and the volatile realities of a less globalized world. They proved that collapse, while traumatic, could clear the ground for profound and lasting innovation. What other seeds of our modern world were quietly sprouting in this fertile soil of renewal? The true identity of the Sea Peoples is no longer a mystery solved by historians alone. Laboratories now hold as many clues as ancient libraries, as an interdisciplinary approach weaves together threads from countless fields. Dendrochronology, the study of tree rings in ancient timber, provides a stark timeline of environmental stress. The narrow, cramped rings from this period tell a clear story of years when the rains failed and the land grew thirsty, directly challenging the agricultural foundations of entire kingdoms. From the silent testimony of skeletal remains, isotopic analysis offers another layer of insight. By studying the chemical signatures locked in teeth and bones, scientists can determine where an individual grew up and what they ate. This technique has the potential to finally map the journeys of the Sea Peoples, tracing their origins across the Mediterranean by reading the subtle geographic clues preserved in their very bodies. Are the remains found in a destroyed Philistine city those of someone born locally, or do their isotopes point to a homeland across the sea? This scientific interrogation turns ancient bones into passports, stamped with a story of migration we are only now learning to read. The quest continues on the seabed, where underwater archaeologists meticulously excavate sunken time capsules. Each shipwreck is a frozen moment of trade, technology, and travel. The discovery of a vessel with a cargo of weapons styled like those at Medinet Habu, or pottery-matching types found in both Greece and Canaan, would be a revolutionary find, physically connecting the raiders to their potential homelands. This powerful collaboration between the humanities and the sciences is transforming our understanding. We are moving from speculation to data-driven conclusions, building a more holistic and evidence-based picture of this pivotal era. The story of the Great Collapse is being rewritten not just by translating clay tablets, but by decoding the chemistry of a tooth and the growth rings of a tree, revealing a past far more complex and interconnected than we ever knew. This great unraveling forced a radical simplification of society, a return to local roots that paradoxically planted the seeds for future greatness. With the grand palaces and their scribes gone, the complex hierarchies that had structured life for centuries simply evaporated. People were grouped into smaller, more defensible communities, often centered around a single hilltop or a protected harbor. In Greece, this fundamental shift in social organization gave birth to the Polis, the independent city-state. This was a revolutionary departure from the old rule by a godlike king. The Polis was, in its earliest form, a community of citizens, a collective body that made decisions for itself. It was from this crucible of collapse, this necessity for self-reliance and collective action, that the first stirrings of democratic thought would eventually emerge. The trauma of losing a centralized authority forced people to invent new ways to govern, laying the philosophical groundwork for classical Athens. A similar process of reinvention was unfolding in the highlands of Canaan. The collapse of the great empires removed the overpowering influence of Egyptian and Hittite overlords, creating a space for new identities to coalesce. The loose confederation of tribes that would become Israel began to form a distinct national consciousness, their stories and laws codified into a powerful monotheistic tradition. The pressure of Philistine settlement on the coast likely accelerated this process, forging a unified kingdom under Saul, David, and Solomon. The very friction of this new world, with its competing smaller states, drove cultural and political innovation at an astonishing pace. The old international order had been stable, but it was also stagnant, dominated by a few superpowers. Its destruction unleashed a torrent of human creativity. The end of the Bronze Age was not a descent into mere darkness. It was a brutal but necessary clearing of the stage, making room for a dazzling array of new actors whose ideas about citizenship, faith, and law would eventually shape the world we know today. Their story is a profound echo across 3,000 years, a whisper that the mightiest of civilizations are not permanent. We have walked through the ruins of Hattusa, deciphered the victory carvings at Medinet Habu, and traced the delicate strands of a global economy that suddenly snapped. This was not a simple tale of invaders and the invaded, but a complex tapestry where threads of a changing climate, brittle economic interdependence, and the movement of peoples all intertwined to unravel an entire age. This ancient crisis holds a dual lesson for us today. It speaks to the incredible fragility of our interconnected systems, reminding us that prosperity built on a single point of failure is a precarious kind of strength. Yet it also sings a powerful song of human resilience and transformation. From the ashes of collapsed empires, new forms of society emerged: the city-states of Greece, the commercial networks of the Phoenicians, the linguistic bridges of the Arameans. The end of one world made space for the birth of another, proving that collapse, while traumatic, can be a brutal but necessary catalyst for reinvention. As we navigate our own era of global challenges, the ghosts of the sea peoples and the world they helped unmake stand as a silent counsel. They urge us to look closely at the foundations of our own civilization, to value flexibility and foresight. What can we learn from their story to build a more resilient future? If this journey into one of history's greatest mysteries has captivated you, please subscribe for more explorations into the deep past, and share your own thoughts on what truly caused the great collapse in the comments below.